No worries, Tom. No worries at all. So let's see. I should probably sit just so that you're kind of looking at me.
Okay.
So I'm going to sit right here. Let me just
Well,
get my notes.
probably it's easier just to move that chair at this point, or I can take the jump off of that chair. Either way.
If you don't mind, let's see. How should we do this? What I'd rather do is just have my notes here. Let's do it like this. This is the first time, you're my first subject that I'm doing the interview, that I'm taping the interview.
Mm-hmm.
Normally, I hire a crew, but we're on tight budget now. So they said, you shoot it yourself. I'm sure you can do it. Vote of confidence. And here's my questions. Okay. So basically, we're going to talk about what brought you to Compassionate Choices and what keeps you with Compassionate Choices. If you could start out by just looking at me and saying your full name and where you live and how long you've been on the board of Compassionate Choices.
So my name is Thomas White. I've lived in this house in Oakland, California for about 7 years.
Okay.
I've been on the board, I think, 3 years. I think I joined in 2011, early 2012.
So you're on the National Board of Directors?
Yes.
Are you also on a local board?
No.
No, okay. So when did you first become aware of Compassionate Choices, and what were your thoughts at the time?
Well, I became aware of Compassionate Choices in 2007. Because in 2007, shortly after we moved into this house, I had a persistent sore throat that didn't either progress to an upper respiratory tract infection or go away. And so I thought that was pretty unusual. So I'm a scientist, so I looked up throat cancer on the National Cancer Institute website, and even though I didn't have the traditional risk factors of excess alcohol consumption or chewing tobacco or smoking, I did have differential hearing loss in one ear. I had recently had my hearing tested, and that was told to me by the audiologist, only something she'd seen before in people with brain cancer. I thought, well, I don't have brain cancer, but the auditory nerve runs up along your throat, and maybe it's being damaged or pressed on. So I went to see an ear, nose, and throat surgeon. Turns out I had advanced stage 4 metastatic cancer of the throat with a pretty poor prognosis of dying within 6 months, or pretty much 50%, 6 months, 90% a year. But anyway, I chose an aggressive form of treatment at that point, and I survived the treatment. But early in 2008, since they were checking me initially every month and then every 3 months to see if it had spread into my lungs or liver or something, I decided, I knew someone else, the son of a close friend who had died of the same throat cancer that I have, and he had a blog that described what the stages of it were, which were pretty horrible. So I had decided I didn't want to do that. So I looked up the Death with Dignity Act in Oregon, and I figured, well, I'll just go up to Oregon because I was collaborating with scientists there anyway. So I looked up Compassionate Choices and arranged a meeting with them and just asked them about, could they explain a little bit more about the law, and I realized that people from out of state weren't eligible, but it wouldn't be too hard for me to reestablish my residency because my wife went to school there and likes Oregon. So they explained in a very gentle and compassionate way what the process would be, and then I initiated. I rented an apartment for a year, I got a bank account, and established my utilities, planned to move up there, was talking to my wife about doing a sabbatical at Reed College, where she had done her undergraduate work and gave a lot of postgraduate lectures and things. With the thought that in that first year, if the cancer was going to recur, it was going to be pretty likely to show up in that first year, and that by establishing residency, then I could take the next steps appropriately. So, but then as it took a while to actually do that, longer than I had expected, because the process for establishing residency requires a lot of documentation that you can't just do in a weekend. It took me probably half a dozen trips. But meanwhile, I kept meeting with the Compassionate Choices people and learning more about it. So that's how I learned about Compassionate Choices. And then after a year, I had survived, and so I decided, well, I can cancel the apartment and I'll come back here and won't proceed with the residency thing. So, but it's nice to know what it takes to do it, because if it does come back, well,
Pick
it
up.
may not be necessary for me to move to Oregon now, like Brittany Manor did, but nonetheless, I can understand what that option would take. And I would take it if the cancer recurs, no question, I would utilize the Death with Dignity Act, so, or something like it.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a doctor there?
I don't. That was the thing that I didn't quite go that step, because that would have involved completing the move, and since I was in close association with 3 different oncologists here, I did ask them all, as well as my personal care physician, to refer me to physicians that they knew of or could recommend in Portland, Oregon. So I was ready, I had all those addresses, and I was ready to actually do that. Because I would still have, time, a few months or something, to complete the process of transferring my records and getting them to 2 doctors to sign, etc.
So yeah, you only have to look at me. You don't have to look at
Okay.
him. So your doctors here were able to recommend doctors that they knew of in Oregon?
Well, they could recommend oncologists
Uh-huh.
and ear, nose, and throat specialists, but not people who necessarily would implement the writing of a prescription for me. I figured I would find that out from Compassionate Choices if I went through the full steps of the process. That would be a problem.
Okay, so you had a real scare and you planned just like a man of science would. You plotted your path. But then what happened as far as your involvement with Compassionate Choices?
Well, because the organization had been of help to me generally, speaking about an advance directive, well, I already had an advance directive, but I could incorporate additional features of it that were highly advisable based on the information I got from them. And then, of course, my wife also wrote her own advance directive, or rewrote it based on what I learned, and it turned out that information became very useful for another reason, which was 2 years after the completion of my treatment, my wife was diagnosed with advanced, inoperable, metastatic stage 4 cancer of the pancreas. And she only lived 4 months, and so though she would not have chosen to use the Death with Dignity Act herself, she respected my wishes to do that. And I should just say that the rationale for me doing it was twofold. One was I didn't want to go through having my jaw removed and a lot of other disfiguring surgery. But secondly, I didn't want my wife to see me going through that. She already seen me go through an extremely difficult series of simultaneous chemotherapy, external radiation, internal radiation, intensive care unit. And the shock of seeing her see me ill, I just realized I'm not going to put her through a painful death. So that's actually why I did it. I wasn't afraid of dying myself at all, but I didn't want my wife to suffer while I died. So that was the purpose of saying goodbye to her in a condition which is like I am now, to say goodbye, that's enough. So, but she didn't choose that. But nonetheless, the information I had received from Compassionate Choice was extremely useful to me in getting palliative care physicians involved immediately in her situation, because dying from pancreatic cancer is extremely painful. And they were able to quickly get her on a maintenance dose of methadone, actually, because she had for years taken hydrocodone for a serious back problem and multiple back operations. They transitioned her to methadone, and so she didn't have systemic pain of any type during the last months of her life. She did choose to enter an experimental clinical trial. New drugs are being tested for pancreatic cancer. I worked closely with the head of the National Cancer Institute, so I got to get him to recommend what he would do, and so we got her into that trial, even though it was randomized, blind trial, and you wouldn't know which arm you were in, standard of care plus a new drug. We actually were able to get her into the appropriate new drug arm, even though it was randomized. I could figure out which arm was the drug arm. And even though she was selected randomly,
To be random.
to tell her but that palliative care information was extremely useful because when her disease was diagnosed, one lung had already collapsed and was filled with 2 liters of fluid. My wife was tough, how she carried around, 4 pounds of liquid for 6 months probably. Amazing. They had to be repeatedly removed with a needle through her back. And then secondly, the other lung already had 2 or 3 marble-sized tumors, so she wasn't going to survive the treatment. And it helped for a while, but eventually overcame her. But most importantly, in the last few days of her life, when the other lung was failing and she was in an intensive care unit, eventually when she realized she was not going to leave the intensive care unit, she wanted to come home for hospice treatment, but she was suffering air panic because she couldn't breathe. And so whenever the systemic morphine would knock her out, and when she'd wake up, she would struggle for breath. It was extremely distressing, terribly frightening for her and for her friends and me, of course, who had to watch her. And so I was able to get the palliative care person to come in again and prescribe sublingual morphine, which relaxes the person. They're still dying of respiratory failure, but they don't panic all the time. And actually, it leads to as peaceful a death as one can obtain under those circumstances. And it was not something that the intensive care unit knew about or did anything about. They even almost resisted. I had to insist. I got the palliative care physician to take over her care in the last day of her life, and so the last day was as good as it could be. 2 days before that were not so good. And so that was another thing that convinced me that Compassionate Choices was a good thing. And I had been donating to it since the Oregon group had helped me, donating directly to Oregon, and then continuing after that. And then when my wife became ill, I began to become even more interested in it after seeing her experience. And then after that, a year later, her father had a serious illness, was in intensive care unit for 4 months. He was 92, couldn't be cured, couldn't really go home. He wanted to just be let go and not have any further treatment. And he had an advance directive and gradually declined. And then one night his other daughter and I said goodbye to him, thinking he would die in the morning, be dead in the morning. The morning came, he was on a ventilator, which was specifically against his advance directive. And so we said, what happened? Of course, you can't speak. And he wrote out and said, well, I was dying. But there was a change in shifts, and the flashing lights went off, and they resuscitated me, and secondly, they ventilated him. And so he was terribly, terribly upset. He was 92 and full cognition. He was a professor at Berkeley. So I said, well, do you want me to stop it? And he writes, yes, And so I said, okay. You understand that if I ask them, they're going to come in and ask you this. You're going to have to answer on writing. He said, yes. He said, you understand they're going to ask you that you'll die if they take it out. He writes, I was dying. They stopped me from dying. So, of course, I want them to take it out. I said, hang on a minute. So I bring the physician and said, his advance directive said not to be on a ventilator. He's on a ventilator. And the guy said, yeah, I'm sorry. It just happened. Right. We didn't have a chance to do the chart. I said, ask him if he wants to be on the ventilater. He was like, what? I said, ask him. So he said, do you want me to know? He writes, no. And then I said, ask him the next question. He said, you understand you'll die if we take you off the ventilator. He wrote, I was dying. You stopped me from dying. Take me off the ventilator. And so the physician goes, I got it. So we left the room, he came back. He's off the ventilator. He takes out the chart, he writes, thank you, holds it up, and gives me a thing. And then he died a few hours later peacefully. So all of those different things, my own experience, my wife's experience, my father-in-law's experience, convinced me that this is an absolutely crucial human right. I'm on the board of the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley, and my attitude is this is a basic human right. R-I-G-H-T and R-I-T-E, literally our last right, spelled both ways. So from both a personal perspective and a societal one and the nature of human rights, I'm fully supportive of the organization.
I want to circle back to one thing that you said. We might as well get right into it. You said that for you, it was a matter of not putting your loved ones through seeing you in your last days.
Yes.
Now, the disability community, as you know, has a real, they give us a real tough time after the Catholic Church and the CMA, saying that's one of their fears, that this law will be abused for precisely that reason, for people not wanting to be a burden on their loved ones. And they translate that as an affront to the disability community. And I wonder if you could address that a little bit from your experience.
Yeah, I spoke at an Institute of Medicine conference recently at Stanford, right after a person who was disabled spoke for the disability community about these same very concerns. And what I said then is what I still feel is true, which is, of course, the disability community should not feel under any pressure whatsoever from the Death with Dignity Act. And there are now 15 years of data from Oregon where there's not been a single abuse of the Oregon law that's involved a disabled person. There's also an interesting article in the New England Journal of Medicine about a year ago in July about the experience in Washington since the law has been passed there, and there's no evidence whatsoever that there's any adverse effect on the disabled. So while I think we should respect the concerns of the disabled community and they should receive the best possible care that they want, you can either follow a so-called slippery slope argument, or you can pay attention to 15 years of data. And in that audience, filled with physicians, they nodded like there's no evidence for it. So if you want to base your decisions on evidence, the evidence is that it's not a threat to the disability community, and that concern should be dissolved.
You're a man of science. I actually should have asked you how do you present yourself, your job title, your specialty?
Well, for the 35 years I've worked in the biotechnology or molecular diagnostic or pharmaceutical industry at 3 different small organizations and large ones like Hoffman and Roche. Although I'm not a physician, I'm a PhD in biochemistry, but I've worked in the medical field for many years, and I have also collaborated with many people in medical institutions. And my whole working career has been in developing new drugs for multiple sclerosis and certain types of cancer of the kidney, as well as all the molecular diagnostic tests that are in common use today for infectious diseases, all of them, the AIDS virus tests, all the hepatitis tests, bring the blood supply, all the genetic tests that are offered, and for bone marrow transplantation. And so I'm pretty knowledgeable about medicine, even though I don't have an MD. I did go to medical school for a year as part of my graduate school studies. I want to learn basic medicine, so I've had medical school courses.
Wow. You're not a doctor, but you play with them as opposed to playing one.
Well, I'm not a physician, but I understand the language of medicine. So actually one thing I do that's related to compassion choices is I often accompany people to meetings with their physicians and listen to the conversation. And then if questions that could be unclear to the patient or answers that could be unclear to the patient, I can ask the physician to explain them, or I can just explain them myself to the person, or suggest to them questions they might ask their physician as well. So it serves sort of as a translator of medical jargon. And for people who are at the end of their life, there are other really interesting studies that have shown that physicians tend to avoid speaking frankly about a fairly dire prognosis, and oftentimes serve up their opinions in very optimistic language. It's actually unrealistic for patients who may have weeks to live, in the best months, where the physician says, well, maybe you'll live a year. And reading a pathology report, I can oftentimes tell that that's simply not going to be the case. A person would be lucky if they live a month. Extensive liver involvement, cancer is spread in ways that are untreatable. So.
Why do you think this culture exists in the medical community, and do you think it's true with younger doctors as well as older doctors?
I think think it exists with older doctors for sure. You know, the American Medical Association, California Medical Association, for a couple of reasons, and this is just my opinion, but also based on what they've said, which is they fall back on the, you know, the notion that they're only supposed to help people, you know, first do no harm. But that's a very shallow interpretation of that rule, or that thing. Doing no harm to people who are dying does not occur when you tell them that they have longer to live than they actually do, or to propose to them to be treated with an extremely rigorous chemotherapy treatment that on average for new drugs can extend a person's life by a month, maybe now it's 4 months, but with severe consequences in terms of adverse effects, versus explaining candidly to people that they may actually have a better end-of-life experience by choosing palliative care or choosing to end their life on their own terms. My own feeling about it for myself is that it all comes down to everyone with a life-threatening disease about the choice between the quality of life or its duration. And I think most people, given that choice, and understand the implications of unwanted or maybe recommended but unwanted treatment, if they really understood the impact of it on their quality of life, wouldn't choose to be treated with something that's going to extend their life by a month. And if they do, that's their decision. I think most people who really understood what the implications are for it might make a different choice, and including the choice to end life on one's own terms when one feels one's had enough.
Why do you think death with dignity has been such a tough law to pass in California?
Well, I think, like in many states, once the process begins to move through the proposition approach or through the legislature, people simply don't want to talk about end-of-life issues. If they're healthy, and if their parents have been healthy so far, sooner or later everybody, of course, have to think about it. But in my cohort at the moment, I had a Compassion Choices event here, and I invited all, you know, a good 15 of my friends. 10 of them were physicians. I'd say about half the physicians came, and the other people were all scientists. But the people with whom the discussion resonated the most, and Robert Brody was here, and also Barbara Combs-Lee, were people who had seen their parent go through an awful end-of-life experience. They were open to it because of witnessing a horrible end of life for someone they loved. And then also, we're all getting older, and they didn't want any of that for themselves. My mother went through a terrible end-of-life experience, and absolutely wanted to die for years. So she would not have been eligible in Oregon. But she had severe osteoporosis of the spine, in which multiple vertebrae had been crushed, and her pain was not treatable by systemic medicine. And she said, in excruciating pain all the time, I can't bear it, I want to die, but my body won't give up. And she oftentimes asked me to help her die, because she was a chemist, and she knew that there were ways that that could be done that were not detectable. And I said, I'm sorry, I can't. I know that that's possible, I can't. It's against the law, I can't do it. And so it was extremely difficult to watch her go through that experience. And even when, in the end, she was in such pain that she couldn't eat or swallow, she suffered really unnecessarily. If she had had the choice, she would have taken it, as her condition declined to come within the regulations for a 6 months end-of-life thing. She absolutely clearly would have done it. In fact, she would have, if it had been possible for her, she would have done it years before that, because pain was excruciating. So it's like having a red hot fireplace poker in your back instead of your spine. And I say to the physicians, can't you treat this? And we're giving her everything we can, but it's not seeming to help her. So anyway, that's just another So why do people not want to talk about it? I think it's because they haven't faced it directly themselves. And when they do, then they become more open to it. The people I've had the most open and candid conversations about with are all people who have a seriously ill patient, and as I say, ask me to interpret their medical situation, or what would I suggest at this particular point. I almost always recommend palliative care, and again, the articles in the major medical journals say the average person requests palliative care 3 to 5 days before they die, instead of months in advance, when it really could do some good and also inform their decisions in a better way. So I think it's probably the same with physicians, but again, another article recently in the New England Journal that just dealt with, it was a really interesting study that dealt with how pediatric oncologists speak to the parents of children who have severe cancer. And there were 2 or 3 really major messages that came from that. One is that the physicians are always extremely overly optimistic about the child's chances for surviving, to the parents extending their life to a year or more, where that's clearly not the case based on how long the child actually did live. And then secondly, they favor encouraging the child to enter into a clinical trial of a new cancer drug, even in phase 1 trials, which are really safety trials. They're not efficacy trials. And that's like over-promising the benefit, where at that stage one doesn't know if a new drug will be of any benefit or be toxic or do nothing. And yet, very frequently, physicians, again, trying to be optimistic and say they can do something, recommend that to parents. And then there's a long list of the euphemisms that are used in the language commonly. And I know from my own experience and my wife's and other friends that adult oncologists also use the same language when speaking to adults. And so it's treating a patient with euphemistic language that's really not helping the patient in the way that the physician could if they were more candid. One can understand the stresses that physicians are under in such a situation, but that should be a formal part of their training. So.
I agree. I think what you were saying earlier, I've often felt that everybody is one bad death away from understanding what it is that we do. So if they've experienced one personally, they get it, and if they have yet to, sometimes it's a little bit more of a battle.
Well, there are 2 people right here on my street who, every year there's an annual block party for the street. And just a couple of months ago, I was chatting with some of the neighbors. They were describing how the mother of one of the people is in an advanced cancer trial, living in the apartment in-law place behind her place. And I said, well, how's she doing with it? She said, oh, she's has terrible adverse effects and experimental drugs. She's sick as can be, but she wanted to try it because the doctor said that could help her live another year. I said, well, what kind of trial is it? They said, well, it's a phase 2 trial. I said, well, then they don't know if the drug's even efficacious or not at all. I said, what? I said, well, no, that's what a phase 2 trial means. These are musicians. So again, there was clear lack of open communication with them. And I said, is she on, you brought in a palliative care physician? And they said, no, she can't sleep. She's agitated all the time. I said, well, you need a palliative care. Here's a really, really good, call up this physician. And so they called the physician, and the physician came and said, well, first of all, we have to get her so she can sleep, and she shouldn't be agitated, giving her steroids at night instead of daytime. Very simple things that a palliative care physician would know. A week later, I ran into the person and she said, thank you so much for this information, and I gave her the Good to Go thing from Compassion in Care, and then I gave her 2 weeks later the Letting Go with Dignity video from Charlie Hamill. And that's a tough video to start to watch. And I said, this is a little difficult for you. You might want to read this look at this right away. But when you're ready, think of it as opening a conversation within your family, because you have brothers and sisters. Probably none of you agree on treatment for your mom. She said, yeah, that's right. And it's so difficult. I said, just watch this. It pauses every now and then to have such a conversation. even though the opening's a little different, actually it's done with a sense of humor about a difficult subject. And so now they've looked at that, and again, the level of their appreciation for their own situation has been enormous. It's all due to Compassion Care's
Compassionate
ability-
choices.
Sorry, Compassion Choice's ability to bring care to the forefront, you know, of these things. And then there's another woman behind me whose husband has Alzheimer's disease, and you could just see the level of exhaustion on her face. But, you know, there again, she is his agent, and he didn't want to be in this situation. And I said, well, there is all of the voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, but you would have had to have that conversation with your husband when he was at full cognition. And she said, well, I have had that conversation with him, but I wasn't really aware of, you know, how that could actually be implemented. So she also has found this introduction to the organization to be helpful in her situation.
You mentioned about your mom and her knowledge of chemistry and asking you to help her to die. What was that? How did that conversation go? Because you felt that you were bound by the law. And how did she respond to that?
My mother felt also that no one should be telling her when she had enough of suffering. That was her decision, that no physician, no person, no church, anything should tell a dying person or a person in extreme pain and suffering what is right for her or anyone else. So her view was essentially that she was blocked by ignorance, I would say, you know. And if she had been able to end her own life, she certainly would have, since for a while she lived up on the north coast of California, and when I would drive her back for a medical visit, there's places where the road has no guardrail and drops about 1,000 feet into the ocean. She would say, pull over here, I want to look at the view. And I'd say, I've got the door on locks, Mom, so you can't get out. She said, no, I just want to get out for me. I said, I know what you're thinking. I'm not gonna let you do that. So it was a difficult conversation because she was alert the whole time, and she knew that the option of ending her own life with a prescription was not going to happen. Even the nursing home, I think, was well aware that she has a sliding door in her room, and on a cold night she'd wheel herself out there and die of hypothermia. So they had to keep an eye on her because she really she was in terrible pain all the time. And so for me, it was a feeling of helplessness. There was no way I could seem to end her pain or even find some legal kind of way to help her end her life. And so it went on for years. It was a terrible, terrible situation. It was another thing that made me think ahead that I will never go through that situation myself. I will certainly not, wouldn't tolerate it.
How long ago was this with your mom?
That was in 1996, or she finally died in 1996. But she'd suffered probably from 92 to 96. So 4 terrible, terrible years.
And 10 years later, you were determined not to be in the same situation as
Right.
far as the
Yeah.
end of your life. So what do we say to people who are still not convinced that this is something that should be legal in California, that should be a law? I know there's a lot of education we need to do. There's a lot of misunderstanding about what the law actually applies to and the slippery slope arguments. But all in all, what would you say if you just had 1 minute to convince somebody that this is actually something worthwhile?
I think I would say that everyone at some point is going to be within 1 year, 6 months, 1 month, 1 week, and then the next day of their death. And so none of us like to think about that, or that we think that we'll die in our sleep. Well, you know, 50% of people die of advanced heart disease or strokes, another 35–40% for cancer, 15% from various forms of dementia or Parkinson's disease. 5% of people die in their sleep, you know. So first of all, they got to realize the chance of dying in sleep is very, very low, and the chance of their suffering an end-of-life situation, and if they survive an initial heart attack, the chances are good they're going to have another one. Strokes are extremely disabling and lose cognition, movement, and everything else. So I think one way to open the conversation is to say, how would you live your life differently? Not only if you only had 6 months to live, but suppose you only had a month to live or a week. What would you do that you otherwise are not doing? And especially if you were suffering and you were with your family and they saw you suffering, would you make a different decision about that for yourself or also for your family? You know, oftentimes people hang on longer than they want because they don't want to upset their family. Well, everyone's death is not about somebody else, it's about them. And they should make their own decision about how they die.
I like that. Let's see.
I'm supposed to give a
You got to be out of here when?
a reference for somebody in 10 minutes.
In 10 minutes,
Yeah,
okay.
that'd be great.
So let's do this. Let me have you, we have all of our people do this. You
Want to sign
already.
a release or something?
Well, no, actually, I'll email that to you. Yeah, that's a whole other thing. I'm not too worried about you, but I will have you sign it just for our records. But in the meantime, I have to find my pen, and I will, let's see,
I've got
here we
one
go.
for you.
Oh, you've already answered this, but I'd like to see you write it out.
Oh,
Here, use this pen.
okay.
And if you want to put the point about the right, last right, I think that's brilliant. Now, what is this committee that you're on at Berkeley? It's the Human Rights
Called the Human Rights Center. They
Center.
sponsor
Okay.
projects that involve, well, various extremes of human rights abuses, but they also have one that involves sexual and gender abuse, and then also a crisis center for things that would involve the United Nations.
Declaration.
Well, it's human rights of all possible persuasions, like 30 different projects a year. I support the projects around the world, so
Wow.
actually that's my principal activity. But let me not answer any more questions while I'm thinking
Go
about
ahead.
this thing for a second.
I'll talk. My great uncle was John Humphreys, and he was actually Eleanor Roosevelt's secretary. He literally wrote the Declaration, but
Oh, right,
based on
yeah.
her.
Well, recently, the Human Rights Center sponsored a program at the Oakland School for the Arts in which the high school students made posters of each of the 32 paragraphs in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And the posters were incredible. I mean, they said, we want you to think about this one.
Each right,
and
yeah.
then draw, because they're artists, make a poster of it. So there were like 3 students per right, about 100 students. And then they presented them. They said, this is why this is an important right for all people, and this is what it meant to me, and here's how I represent it. It blew the entire audience away.
Oh, wow.
It had a profound effects on all these 100 middle school students down there, high school students. Great.
Is that something I could see online, perhaps?
I might still have a link to it. It was
Okay.
maybe 2 years ago or 18 months ago.
I love that kind of creative.
Okay.
All right, now hold it up. Let's get a good
Let's
shot
see,
here.
I'm gonna have to move out
Oh
of the
my,
sun
yes.
A little bit.
Oh, got a lot there, okay. No, actually, now you're in the sun. Let me
Now I'm in
move.
the sun, okay.
Let me move.
Well,
This way.
you-
There. No, you're good, you're good.
Is this okay?
Yeah, much better. My finger wasn't in there, it'd be even better. Oh, thank you so much.
Okay.
We're
well,
good, we're good.
Sorry I don't have more time, but I'm